You're listening to the Tilehurst End Podcast by Reading fans for Reading fans.
Welcome to the Tilehurst End Podcast, the podcast by Reading fans for Reading fans. I'm Marc Mayo, joining you today for a bit of a midweek special. We have got Luke Anthony, the former fitness boffin of Reading Football Club, 2007 to 2015. Luke, it's a pleasure to have you on. We've got, such a long time at the club, plenty to talk about. A fitness boffin probably wasn't your exact job title, was it?
No. So when I joined the club, I was first team physiotherapist, and then I became head of medical a couple of years later on. So that was my sort of official titles.
Great. So you were, so was that entire period, fans obviously know physios, generally speaking, as the guy who runs onto the pitch while a player is down. Were you doing that for the entire duration at the club or just the start?
No, so when I joined in 2007, John Fern was the head of medical services then. He left to go to Chelsea about 3 years after, I think. And so that was his job, was the sort of the lead physio up until that time. So I sort of, I guess, started doing the day-to-day pitch work from that 2010 onwards for about sort of five seasons after that.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about John Fern because you came into the club. He's now at Chelsea and is very highly regarded from what I know of the physio footballing world. How was it? You came into the club working under someone who obviously very highly regarded and everything. How was it as you joined the club and started getting settled in working with with John Fern and people?
Yeah, so I'd known John for a while. I was my previous job, I was working in rugby, Gloucester Rugby, and prior to that, I was head of medical at Watford Football Club. So I've known John, professionally for a number of years. And then he asked me to sort of come on board with the team in 2007, and it was great. Yeah, working with him, fantastic. He's an exceptional physiotherapist, and that's why he went to Chelsea and has had such a good career since then.
Yeah, for sure. So what state was the club in when you got to it? As you worked elsewhere, as you say, Watford and Gloucester Rugby and stuff, what was the position of kind of the medical facilities and how Reading was positioned kind of in the spectrum of clubs in terms of, being up with the times in that sense?
Yeah, I think, sports medicine in football has changed a lot. People talk about, big changes in the last few years. But when I first started in 1998, I was one of two physiotherapists within the whole club. There was no fitness coach. You didn't have, a goalkeeping coach. It seems like a long time ago now. And things obviously change, year by year. So I think, I came into a good club. Reading was a good club. It was the second year in the Premier League season that obviously, had some investment in the club over the previous years, dealing with a high quality, group of players in that Premier League. So I was fortunate to come into the club into a good state.
How was it as a club in general, as you say, in the Premier League at that time? It was very exciting. What was the vibe and mood and as a new person getting involved, how kind of welcomed and everything did you feel from kind of day one?
Yeah, no, very much so. It was an interesting time at the club because it was the club's second year in the Premier League, and obviously had that fantastic promotion season, an exceptional season, first year in the Premier League. And I sort of joined. It was the same group of players, same manager, same group of staff and players who'd done so well with the team over the years. But that it was a tough season actually. We started reasonably well, and we hit a bad patch, I think, just after Christmas, and then ended up being in that relegation mix and relegated. That last game of the season away at Derby on goal difference, which was a real tough time, real low moment actually. So it was interesting because obviously the same group of players, but just, it was a tough time results wise, was certainly a tough time in that season.
Yeah, I remember being in the stands at Derby and everything around that. And I suppose, out of interest, is Reading your club? What do you have a team?
No, not by background. I grew up with a family of Tottenham Hotspur supporters, generations of Spurs fans. So, but it's funny. And then when you work in football, you sort of lose that. You become really an armchair supporter of football. You're with the club that you're with. So whether it was Watford or Gloucester or Reading or Norwich, that's your team and that's who you're behind. But I'm back in the area now, and actually we have the season tickets now, so I take my children up, and we still go to most games. So I'm probably as much as anyone a fan of the club now.
Oh, great. Well, it's interesting as well when you talk about like the Derby game and stuff like that. Where, in terms of like the medical team and stuff, I know you're obviously integrated and everything, but where do you kind of, let's say we've just been relegated. Do you then, as a group of physios and stuff, then have a little chat amongst yourselves, or are you kind of just in amongst everything? Do you have, almost a little clique, as it were, or are you just so integrated with the squad and everything that you're just kind of all talking about it and all feeling it together?
Yeah, I remember it. I mean, sitting in that Derby dressing room, I've been to that ground a number of times, and it's tough. You sort of sit in your corner. Everyone's very quiet. No one really says anything, and you feel that whole despondency. Everyone in that whole dressing room feels it. It's tough for everyone at the club. Whatever your job is, obviously player, coaching staff, medical staff, whatever your job at the club is, you sort of do live and die by results, and how well the football club is doing will sort of dictate, how well your job is going and how much you're sort of, enjoying yourself. So it was definitely a tough moment for everyone on that side of it. But I guess the same as everything else, you've got, your job to do. You sort of look after the players, same as you would after any other game. And, you head into an off season and you have your review and dust yourself down and get ready to go again the next year.
Yeah, for sure. And I wonder, you said about going to Pride Park, are there any grounds that you visited over the years that you thought, oh, this is amazing, this is real high quality stuff, and actually some you went to and thought, God, this is like, being back in kind of club rugby and not back in the 90s sort of thing?
No, I've been fortunate all my career. I've worked in the top 2 divisions, and you go to all those clubs, and there's not many bad ones around now. There was a few that were tough previously. You went to the old Rotherham ground, or, Valley Parade when we went there in the cup at Bradford, and there's a couple that aren't so good, but generally speaking, they're much of a muchness, and the Premier League grounds are, the away dressing rooms are never anything special. They're sort of fairly plain, but they're functional. And yeah, it's interesting, because when you first start, my first few years, you're traveling around to these grounds, you go to Anfield and Old Trafford and all these, this is fantastic, this is, it's unbelievable. And that's one thing. As you get older, and as you've seen it, a number of times, and those trips on the road, they lose a little bit of their luster over the years. And once you've seen them, they sort of can blur a little bit into one. But yeah, no. In answer to your question, nowadays, in terms of like the big grounds, there's no bad grounds now. So no, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So you came in then working under Steve Coppell, of course, was the manager when you started. How close are you to the managers then? Do you spend, do you have kind of a weekly meeting and catch up, or are you just kind of dropping in bits of information here and there? Because there are quite often, I've read and stuff, that you won't necessarily always have perfect, like if there's a very minor issue that a player has, that might not always necessarily get to the manager to kind of say, oh, this player's got a little issue or something. Is it a case that you kind of, how close are you to the managers when you're working with them?
So as I said, when I first joined, John was the head of medical, and so I had a little bit less link with someone like Steve at the time. But afterwards, with the managers that I worked with afterwards, so from Brendan and Brian and Nigel, Steve, yeah, you work very closely. You have a meeting every day, every morning before training starts. So you have a sort of roundup of who's training, who's not training, where people are. You'll probably have another conversation. You'll share an office, so you'll probably have another conversation later on in the afternoon about where everyone's at. And you spend a lot of time together informally, whether it be at lunchtime or on the coach going to a game or in a hotel. So there is a lot of communication there from that point of view. And different managers will, like information in different ways. So some will want to know as much as everything that you can tell them about every niggle, every knock. Others less so. They don't really want to be bothered by things that aren't necessarily going to be relevant. But but that communication is really important. I think it's crucial that everyone's aligned, manager, player, medical staff. It's so important that alignment is right. And I think that's when things can start to break down, when either the communication or the the sort of views on that side sort of slightly differ.
Yeah, were there any times when that happened then? Because I mean, I imagine someone like Rodgers is going to be very, particularly at the time, would have been very modern. Maybe someone who wanted to know everything and all the detail and stuff. And then you've also got someone like Brian McDermott, who I can imagine. I mean, he's just generally speaking a kind of great guy to be around and everything. So perhaps very easy to deal with as a physio. Was there any times when you found that the communication was kind of difficult?
I think, Brian's a good example, really. So he would be very open with me. We'd, talk through the week in terms of he'd know the team that he wanted to put out that weekend. So if you had a player who was maybe not quite right, needed a bit more time, he'd be very open to that and said, well, look, I don't need him this week, but I really could do with him next Saturday. So, you have the whole week to say, well, look, we can just work on this now, work on this injury. Don't have to worry about pushing for a game on the weekend and look to drop him back into training next week. And it generally works well. But he may equally say, look, I need this, this player for this weekend. So whatever we can do. And, you sort of push and on that side of it. And, there's always risks when players come back from injury. There's always a risk that they'll break down. But at the same time, you can't, take forever. It's professional sport. So these players are paid to play, and you need your best players out on the weekend. So there's pressure sort of either way. But Brian was good with that. Other managers will be less communicative, and that can be an issue because you'll push a player because he'll sort of intimate that he wants a player for the weekend, and you'll push hard with that player, get to the weekend, and then the player's not even in the squad. Then you've got a double issue because you pushed the player hard. He's sort of not happy with you. And then you've got to go again next week. And you can sometimes be a bit in the middle of those things. And that's where that communication with the manager really helps. And, I've throughout my whole career, really, I've worked generally with excellent managers, really, really good managers who were good to work with. But occasionally, it's tough. And listen, managers, it's a tough job. So, but that communication, is really important. So having that and being able to sort of plan and it creates, well, I think, it helps to create that success. And I think, the success that Brian had, really the communication he had with the whole of the staff, was really sort of important on that side.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you left the club in 2015 as well, which was before we kind of got into this era that we're kind of still in of a different manager every year, or even two different managers a year. And I can imagine that must be much more difficult when you're changing constantly. I mean, towards the end of your time, we'll come back and talk about the playoffs and championship win and stuff, but towards the end of your time, you had Adkins come in, and then halfway through the season, Steve Clarke comes in, and you must, as a physio, have to kind of readjust your how much of your job do you have to readjust for a new manager?
Yeah, I think the basics of the job are the basics of the job. You've got to look after the players. They get injured, you assess, you rehabilitate, you get them back on the pitch, and there's that sort of daily cycle of those things. So that part of the job doesn't change, at all. It's the bit around the job, really. So, I've always been, hugely respectful of the managers that you work for, and they sort of will set the rules in terms of how they want it done. I don't mean in terms of the day-to-day management of the players. I mean more in terms of the communication and they'll have an opinion on how they want their players pushed, or how quickly they want those players pushed. So, again, that's where having that alignment, it's tricky. So some people, so Brian or Nigel would want a lot of communication. They'd be happy, you'd be in meetings together. But other managers, would want to keep the medical department more sort of distant from that side of it, which completely respect on that side. But it can sometimes have an impact when the communication barrier or alignment isn't quite there. And I think that's when it can become a bit more sort of tricky on that side of it.
Yeah, well, let's talk some players then. And I mentioned I'm aware, obviously, there is kind of the confidentiality side of things. So you're kind of, if whatever you can share would be great. But I'm aware, obviously, if there's any kind of details that you're very much allowed to be economical with the information that you share. But how was it dealing with certain players then? Are there any players that stick out for you as really good to deal with that you really enjoyed on a kind of day-to-day basis?
I think the majority of them, really. I think it's Reading. I mean, the clubs I've worked at, Reading, Norwich, Watford, similar clubs, that sort of bottom end Premier League, top end Championship, not historically big spending clubs, accumulated sort of good players. and good types. And I say the majority of players, certainly at Reading, very good to work with. That the group that you come in with in 2007, they've had a huge success at the club. Not a lot of them were brought in on huge money to the club, and they were an excellent group to work with. And I think that really the basis of the club's success, actually, in certainly the first few years that I was at the club was based on that. Get recruitment of not just good players, but good people, and having that sort of good playing staff is really important. So high level of professionalism, train well, when they're injured, they would do the right things. They would respond well to rehabilitation. They'd work hard on that side of it. They would be open to the ideas that I brought in, over the years in terms of injury prevention. And, that was a sort of a hard thing to do because you're asking players to do things that they hadn't done previously. And, but it takes a while to evolve that system, but it worked well. And again, that's sort of, credit to the group of players that we had, but so many over the years, good professionals, each of those sort of groups, and look at the sort of the captains, the senior players in each of those groups. So from sort of Ivar Ingemarson, you've got players like Joby McAnuff, Mikael Ledgerwood. There's loads of them. So many sort of real good professionals. But I have to say, Mark, the majority of them, the vast majority, are excellent professionals on that side.
Yeah, for sure. So what sort of, as the job kind of evolved, then what sort of lifestyle changes were you asking to bring in? I mean, less 3 a.m. nightclub trips before the game, on the nights of games and stuff, yeah. Or was it just as simple as kind of nutrition and?
Yeah, I think so. From my point of view, it was looking at the injury prevention side. So obviously the most prominent injuries in football, musculoskeletal injuries, muscle injuries, hamstring, quad, calf, groin, ankle, knee ligament injuries. So we sort of looked at those and think, well, how can we be in a practical way put together a sort of a preemptive rehabilitation program for the whole squad to be able to sort of do. And so we sort of put that in place bit by bit as the years went on. So it's things they do before training. So we'd have them in groups working before training, working on sort of specific muscle strengthening exercises, range of movement exercises, sort of joint control exercises, balance exercises. And it is hard because even the modern day players at the time, there's a bit of resistance to it. It's, you're saying to a player, we're putting these things in to try and reduce the prevalence or the incidence of cruciate ligament injuries or hamstring injuries. And they'll say, well, I've never had that injury. So, why am I doing something to prevent an injury that I've never had? Which obviously doesn't mean to say they won't have it in the future. But you do set yourself up for it because you then put an intervention in place to prevent a hamstring injury. And if, as the player then does that, yeah, and then so you set yourself up to sort of fail in some respects, but it doesn't work like that. And what you do is your audits each season, and we were able to sort of refine it as we went on. But our injury record was good. That's one of the proudest things over the years that the injury record is not always just a result of the things you do because there's lots of other factors into it. But I think that we managed to sort of manage those things and well, who knows? But the prevention side of it, I think, worked well, from that point of view.
Yeah, well, I was going through my research for this. I was going through trying to think of the kind of top injuries that I wanted to ask about. Top injury sounds weird, doesn't it? But the injuries to ask about, and there weren't many, and I can't think of injury crises. These things where, I mean, we'll talk a bit. I do want to ask later on about the club these days, but look back to those seasons, and I think that was a big part of the success as well. Is that in that Brian McDermott team that won the championship, you can count on one hand how many players had extended periods of time out. And if that wouldn't have been the case, if we'd have lost 5 or 6 key players, then we probably wouldn't have got promoted. So in that sense, there must be a serious amount of job satisfaction to come at the end. And you think that, I think that Jem Karachan broke his ankle, which obviously wasn't kind of your guys' fault or anything. So other than that, I can't think of many serious injuries that really popped up that season.
No, I mean, like all these things, it's a group effort. So the players, worked hard on what we were trying to do. The coaching staff provide an excellent sort of training program. The manager is very aligned with his staff. So I think and then obviously when you're winning games, that really helps. So, I think it's a two-way road, that one. So definitely keeping players fit helps the team to perform well. But when the team are performing well and playing well and winning games, then, it keeps people on the training ground and keeps people sort of moving along on that side of it. But no, we weren't too bad. Like you say, Jem had that injury. It was more a case of like the little niggles that you have to manage through the season. I think that was the hardest part. So, there was a number of them. Jimmy Kebe would be a good example of someone who played pretty much every game, but there's always niggles to manage him just to get him through one week to another week. But credit to him, he had an excellent season, and he ended up having surgery at the end of the season on a tendon injury and came back fine after that. But he was one that needed management. And the other one that I think I remember well was Mikel Ledgerwood. So in the same game that Jem injured his ankle against Leeds in a home game around Easter time, I think Mikel had quite a nasty knee injury, medial ligament injury in the same game, had to go off, and we had to work very hard with him. And again, credit to him how hard he worked on his rehabilitation, and obviously he was then able to come back and play sort of an important part at the end of that season. So I guess there is a certain amount of satisfaction for the just for the achievement of the team, really, and to have some part in that was it was cool.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to ask about that Karacan injury as well, actually, because how much do you work on the kind of mental side with players then? Because Jem Karacan's a player who, I mean, obviously had a great time at Reading and stuff, but this was kind of the absolute peak of his career at that point. He was a young player, really nasty tackle and stuff, and I mean, I presume you'd have got on the pitch and realised relatively quickly that it was what it was, and then you have to manage a player for several months without them playing, don't you?
Yeah, so that one was a poor tackle. I remember it well. It was a really poor tackle in the game, and Ledgerwood, in the same game, same opposition player, again another poor tackle. But Jem was unfortunate, broke his ankle at that stage. Obviously, that wrote his season out. But tremendous how well he sort of recovered, how hard he worked, because he came back and played sort of early part of the following season. So he was out in the off season, did his rehabilitation in the summer, and then came back, the following preseason and actually played, a lot of games in the Premier League that year, which was good. He was obviously unfortunate because a couple of seasons later is when he injured his cruciate ligament, and that was the big injury for him. And that was less straightforward. So his ankle, he rehabilitated remarkably well. The cruciate ligament injury was a much more serious injury, and then it required surgery, and so that was a tough one for him to come back from. But again, give him an enormous amount of credit. He would have been through a tough time as a player at the club at that stage. But yeah, he managed to get himself through it and then sort of come back out the other end.
Yeah, for sure. And he's a player actually that I hear or I've heard in the past is one of the fittest players at the club, and generally speaking. And what players have you found over the years that were really fit and just ready to go and could run a marathon every day, sort of thing?
Well, he could run for sure, no doubt about that. That was one of his big attributes. Chris Gunter is a good example of someone who's durable, robust player, can run all day, and incredible amount of games. I mean, obviously, held the Welsh record for amount of appearances, but every club he plays at, he can play 50, 60 games a year.
Yeah.
And he did that through Reading, and he'd train every day. His outputs in training would be the top outputs every day. If you put him on a 10K race, he would win. He could do that every day and clock a good time. So, he was good. But yeah, I mean, different athletes in different ways. So, some were quicker. So Jimmy Kebe, a good example, sprint athlete, but he could run all day. And there are plenty of others over there. James Harper, run all day. But you've got other athletes, who are at the top end of it. So Shane Long, in terms of his speed, his ability, but particularly obviously his first time at the club. So, there's all sorts of different players with different abilities. And nowadays they can all run. I mean, I think that's probably the biggest difference to sort of in the 90s where, they were sort of slightly different shapes. All the players now, to be competitive now, you have to be able to run. That's an integral part of the game. Yeah.
How is it with a player? I mean, a player that just popped into my mind then was Matthew Mansett, who was an absolute unit as a player. Is it true that those sort of players who are, 6'3" or so, big stocky lads, are they more vulnerable to the injuries that, of like the ligament and stuff because they are ultimately carrying around a big amount of body muscle and stuff?
Yeah, no, the research will tell you no. The main two predictors of injury are age and having had previous injury. So if you've had a previous hamstring injury, you are more likely to have another hamstring injury than the next person. Same if you've had a cruciate ligament injury. And older players will generally pick up more injuries and recover slightly less quickly than younger players. But in terms of size, no. So I got asked for an article for a newspaper about Haaland when he came across this country from Germany about his injury risk, and same question was asked actually about his size and things. But there isn't good evidence to suggest that if you're a particular body shape, big or small, that you'll have more injuries. I'm sure there's a genetic component to it. Some players have a slight genetic predisposition, but in terms of the research, previous injury and age are the biggest two determinants of future injury.
Yeah, and one player who was older when he came to the club was Jason Roberts, and he had a massive impact, obviously, when he came in, helped win the championship. The Premier League season was a bit trickier, though, and I wonder from your perspective, because you would have worked a lot with him in terms of getting him fit and stuff, and it felt like there was kind of setback after setback, and the age factor obviously would have been a big component of that. But how was it working with Jason, who, again, I would feel like is such a professional, but it just ultimately didn't work out, did it?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, he had a brilliant impact when he first came, but I was just reading the other day that I saw it was his 45th birthday, which made me feel old. So he would have been must have been 35 when we signed him at the club.
Yeah,
35 at that age is, that's coming towards the end of a player's career. And, we had a brilliant half a season out of him. And you're right, the Premier League season was tricky. He got injured in a game. I remember away at Southampton, hip injury, and he struggled to get back fit after that. It was something that he was sort of a bit in and out with after that, and never really could make that full recovery. And again, that's what led to him sort of finishing his career.
Yeah, which wasn't a huge surprise. One story which is, I think that maybe fans who are a bit younger maybe and haven't supported the club quite as long, but I remember it being at the time it was a really sad story. Ultimately, it was Chris Armstrong, a player who was, an absolute brilliant left back and everything, and ended up being diagnosed with MS. And how involved with all that were you, and how was that to deal with for a footballer? Because it's not an injury, is it?
Yeah. No, so I remember it was a Saturday morning at the club, and we were training. I can't remember why there wasn't a game, but it was a Saturday morning at the club, and he came into the treatment room, just said, "Don't feel quite right." But it was slightly strange. The symptoms that he was presented, were very strange, and so we got the doctor involved and said, "Look, what do you think?" And okay, we need to get him checked out. And then, you go through this process and quite quickly realise that he isn't quite right. And we had the diagnosis of MS. Which was a huge thing. I think it was either the year before. I think he was the player of the season. Player of the season the year before. That. And, all of a sudden you've gone from a player who's your sort of first choice fullback to someone who was in a very bad way. I mean, I think anyone who would have been around him at the club would have seen, him. He was a shadow of a professional football player. Was in a really, really bad way, and we weren't quite sure what his sort of future was going to hold. But he started, some treatment, and bit by bit, he sort of got himself a bit better. And I can remember coming into the club in the summer and saying to him, what do you think? What's your thoughts? And he said, well, I want to play, So, okay. Well, and I remember, we went outside on the grass, and we did our rehabilitation, and, it was like, it was like training with a sort of an under seven, someone who struggled to kick the ball or couldn't really balance properly, or couldn't, do two keep ups on the row, and thinking, this is going to be tough. And we sort of did it out the way of all the rest of the group, and, out the eyes of anyone else, and just went through it. And just week by week, suddenly, he can do 10, 15 keep ups, and then suddenly, he can start to pass the ball better, and he can run better, and he can start, put together some, and, he just worked at it. He just kept going and kept working, and bit by bit, he managed to, go through the layers, got himself back into training with the group, trained well, got himself back into the team. played some games, and it was remarkable. He did well, and he was sort of did remarkably well. But obviously, it's tough. The diagnosis doesn't go away, even though you're better and you're managing yourself better. It's not solved. It's not like an injury where you're cured. So you're having to sort of manage that, and I think had to take a decision at the end of the season whether he was going to carry on playing or retire. And obviously, there's some financial implications both way on that side of it. So. He made a decision. He played some lower league, non-league football afterwards. He went back home, obviously from the Sunderland area. But no, it was an incredible story really for him to go from where he was to get back into the team and play games in the team was remarkable. And such a strong character, very unassuming, very quiet, but an incredible inner strength that he had. And so yeah, it was a remarkable story.
Yeah, for sure. It's such a unique one as well, and it's almost one. I almost feel like it's one that I kind of want to hear about how he's getting on these days as well. I don't know if you're. Do you keep in touch with these players at all?
Yeah, not recently. Not recently with Chris actually, but yeah, with nowadays. I mean, it was good obviously last year to have the game, the sort of anniversary game at the stadium. I mean, that was brilliant to see. Sort of both sets of lads that I'd worked with, and it was such a fantastic day. I think the players loved it. They saw all their old teammates again, and it was that was fantastic. And again, nowadays with social media, you sort of you're sort of half in touch with these sort of people. And we run a clinic, a sports injury clinic in Reading now, so we still have these people coming in from time to time as well. So yeah, no, it's always good to sort of speak to these boys from the old days.
Yeah, for sure. And how was it with winning the championship then? As your memories of the game against Nottingham Forest when we got promoted, and then the kind of weird scenario that we actually won the championship having drawn earlier in the day and stuff. How was it, as I've asked earlier about being kind of integrated with everything? And were you in terms of like the open top bus tour and everything, would you hop on the bus? I obviously can't remember who exactly was on the.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, the Notts Forest game was obviously it's a special evening. And partly this is the nature of the job. I remember I had to be in London the following day. Jimmy Kebe had an appointment in London the following day. I think it was like 8:00 in London. So we had to see a specialist then. So, you've always got one thing, going on after another. And I think that season, it was an incredible achievement for the football club, for the players, the manager, the staff. I mean, it was absolutely fantastic, and you can enjoy that. We went to Marbella. We had a trip to Marbella as players and staff afterwards, and but what it was exhausting. You get to the end of the season, and I don't. If you look back on it, how much you actually enjoy it, because the game, it's a fairly stressful period over a long period of time, no matter what your job is at the club, because you're constantly trying to, keep work with players to have them fit to play games, and all those games are big pressure games. They're enjoyable to look back on them. Those fantastic wins against West Ham and Southampton and Brighton and Notts Forest. All these games, were fantastic victories. But the build up to them the week before, the build up on the day, the game, they're quite sort of stressful. And once you then get over the line, with the Notts Forest game and the season's finished, you're sort of exhausted really on that side of it. So it's a relief to have achieved what the club has achieved, and then you sort of move on, and before you know it, you're back in pre-season and you're straight into it. But the open top bus was good. My just memory of that is just getting soaked. It was
it was wet.
It rained and was wet. But I mean, listen, very lucky to be part of something like that. To be enjoy the success that the club's had, and to be sitting on the top of an open top bus was a brilliant memory for me.
Be loud and be proud and back the boys and make some noise. Come on, you Oz!
Shout out to this week's podcast sponsor, ZCZ Films, showing that age is no barrier to being a hula hoop.
Welcome back then to the Tilehurst End Podcast, our interview with the former Reading fitness guru, Luke Anthony. Just before the break, we were talking about having players back over pre-season and stuff, and it made me think about the summers, and it's kind of a bit of a cliche in a way, but the old worry of players coming back after their summer, and maybe they've enjoyed themselves a little bit too much over the summer period, and they come back a bit hefty, shall we say? Is that really a big problem for you guys, or is there occasions it has happened to you?
No, not really. Again, when I first started back in the 90s, it was slightly different. Players had a bit longer off. They were a little bit less structured in their off season, and you'd have to spend the first few weeks of pre-season really getting them fit, and then some of them losing some excess weight. Nowadays, not really the case. The players, I think, the off seasons are less. And they're much more structured, and players have plans to work to, and players know they need to come back fit. So you'll test on day one of pre-season, and then they're pretty much straight into it. So football work, training starts that week, and then they'll play games within sort of 10 days, 7-10 days. So there is no real capacity for someone to come back and require 10 days, 2 weeks to get fit or to lose weight. That just, they'll be so far behind at that stage. So that's not really the sort of the case nowadays, certainly in sort of the professional game.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. Yeah, I'm aware that there is still the post-game pizza floating about in certain clubs and everything. And that's one that fans always like, is that really like good or?
Yeah, from a nutrition point of view, having some form of sustenance after a game is important to do that quite quickly. But it's funny. I think one of the things over the years is when you in a football club, environment, you spend a lot of time together, and both training ground in the week, bus journeys, hotels, games. And especially if you play midweek games, if the food's the same and it's sort of particularly bland, it can be sort of hard work. And one of the things I think that, particularly a club like Reading, is meal times are a good time to sort of bond people together. So, I've been in hotels where, players will eat at whatever, 7:00, and the food's a bit bland, and maybe the culture of the team isn't quite so together, and everyone sort of eats and then they'll leave and they'll be back in their rooms on their own or whatever at sort of 7:30, 7:45, where, other places, if you sort of, they'll eat nutritiously and healthily, but gives them a bit of, I don't know, ice cream, apple crumble ice cream for dessert, and a few little treats afterwards. And, that helps, just little things like that help to keep the boys together, and they'll end up, spending a bit longer eating together. You'll put the football on in the evening, they'll watch the game. And so I think having, a little bit of balance to it, really, you gain more than you lose by, theoretically an extra little bit of fat or sugar content temporarily.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes me think of the one Reading tradition that I think is still alive today, and I'm pretty sure was alive when you were there, was the first away day karaoke in front of all the squad. And I wonder, did you have to do that? Did that apply to the physios?
So not really in my time, but yeah, it's a horrific moment when a player has to sort of stand up and sort of sing on his first game. I don't know if that still goes on now, but it has. It's been interesting. Broken a few people over the years. That has.
Who have you seen that was particularly good or bad?
I remember Wayne Bridge was particularly good. He did a version of his wife's obviously in the Saturdays, and he did a version of the Saturdays. And I remember, Matthew Connolly, he's an introverted sort of person, lovely guy, but it just, horrendous having to sort of, for someone like him, having to, stand up in front of a group. So, but yeah, generally most of the boys will sort of embrace it and have a bit of a go. There's not that much sort of singing talent out there, but yeah.
Yeah, no hidden stars are there. I was wondering as well, in terms of, I mean, these are kind of things that I guess must happen quite rarely, or maybe even not at all, as you'll say. But how many times did you kind of run on a pitch to deal with a player, maybe late in a game, and you kind of get to them and you realise, I don't know at what point you realise, but they are ultimately just down to waste time, and you kind of get there and you think, is this an injury? What kind of goes through your mind in that moment?
Yeah, I think when you've watched so many games, that pitch side for literally 1,000 games, you sort of know when you're watching the game, you have a good idea of what's serious and potentially serious and what isn't. So again, having worked in rugby, you have done 3 seasons in the Premier League in rugby, you sort of see that's what's serious. And, when you see what passes for requiring potential medical treatment in football versus rugby, it's very different for the majority of cases. But, I see it now. I see it when I'm watching it on TV or I'm watching it in a stadium, and you know that this is generally something that is just a time wasting tactic on that side of it. I guess that's for the club to sort out. Certain managers would be sometimes keen for you to run on, sometimes less keen for you to run on, in situations. And it's one of the sort of the harder, sort of more nuanced parts of the job in terms of running onto the pitch, because obviously when you treat a player, then the player has to come off. And if you're about to defend a corner and your centre half has just gone off the pitch, then that's not ideal. So you have to realise that you have to give the player every chance to not go on, for you not to have to go on the pitch, so that he can stay on to defend. And there are other circumstances where a manager will be keen for you to go on because, to slow the game down and that. So I'll always say to a manager, that's not my job isn't to win you the game from that point of view. Or, if you have to play with 10 men because we've got an injured player, that's really for the team and the manager to sort out. And I think you're on dangerous ground once you start, getting medical staff involved in tactical things like that. That's a sort of not a good area to be in from that point of view. But to be honest with you, the majority of managers, work with very good on that side of it. But it goes on. It goes on all the time. And I say sometimes you just got to be, the nuance of if a player is coming off and you need the substitute to give him time to be able to come on the pitch. So you may have to take an extra 30 seconds or whatever and deal with something on the pitch. So that happens for sure, and that's part of it. That nuance is part of it. But in terms of just deliberately wasting time, I'm certainly not a fan of it. I mean, I watch it on TV and it drives me mad watching it. So
as a fan,
I'm not a fan of that.
No, for sure. The only other question I've got of this nature that is perhaps a slightly less serious question is, did you ever have a player come in, and I mean, this is obviously through your entire career as well as Reading, come in, 8 a.m. on a Thursday or whatever, starting training, and they come in, they say, I'm a little bit hungover. Have you got something that can pep me up a little bit for training?
I have had it with the players once at Reading, I have to say, and then once before at a previous club. It's not a common thing, that's not a common thing, and that's something that is, we sort of joke about it now, but that's an issue. So that's an issue that you'd have to deal with as a for a number of reasons. One is what's going on and what's the background to that as well, and. These days, most players aren't big drinkers or aren't really. It's a much different alcohol culture compared to how it was in the 90s, for sure. But no, that isn't really a big thing, for sure.
There is, I mean, as speaking to a medical person, not that this is interesting personally, but I guess there isn't really a cure for a hangover that can get you going that quickly, is there?
No, not really. The only cure is not to indulge in the first place. So, but no,
prevention.
Suck it up and get on with it.
Lovely. Well, the last couple of questions then, because I know you left the club in 2015, kind of at the end of the season when Steve Clarke was in charge. What were the circumstances around that? Was that your decision? Was that something that you wanted to, after quite a few years at the club, you wanted to experience something else? You went to Norwich. Did they kind of come to you and say, let's have a, because they would have been in the Premier League then, I think?
Yeah. So no, it was a manager's decision for me to leave at the end of that season. I was one of a number of changes that he sort of made himself. And it was tough, actually. It was a tough time. Been at the club for 8 years. One thing you can sort of be proud of as a physio is, it's for other people to judge how good you are. But we worked hard, day in, day out. I think we're consistent through that period of time. And, it's tough. But the job as a physiotherapist at the club, you're at the beck and call of the football club. So you get a call on a Sunday morning, it's your day off, but it's a Sunday morning, there's a player who, needs something, then you have to go in. You have to attend to that player so that you can report back to the manager. So on Monday morning, and, you have to sacrifice a lot. You just can't plan anything. It can be off season. I've had to come back early from holidays to do medicals on players. It's a big commitment. It's a fantastic job. I mean, it's, an absolute, privilege to work in professional sport and to work at the clubs that I've worked for. So you do it willingly and, as I said, I don't for a minute take it for granted. It's such a privilege to have done the job as I've done. But it is a hard job. And I think when you, at the end of it, when someone says, well, look, actually, we're making some changes and that's the end of you, then that's a hard thing to sort of take at that stage. So I left the club then in the summer, and then, like you say, Norwich were in the Premier League. They got promoted the previous season, and then I was contacted by someone to say, do you want to come into the club? They were looking at setting up some injury prevention stuff, and I'd obviously been involved in that as part of my time at Reading. And so that was really my job at Norwich City, was to sort of develop their injury prevention strategy and work with the first team on that. And that's good, brilliant club. We ended up getting relegated, but it was a brilliant experience. And I had a really enjoyable few seasons up at Norwich.
Yeah, and I suppose that links into now the fact that you're a bit more of a 9 to 5 now, isn't it, with Go Perform back in Reading?
You think so? Yeah, you think so. There's certainly a little bit more sort of control of it. We set the company up after I left Norwich, and with my colleague from Reading, who left at a similar time, Dan Buchanan. So it's good. Yeah, I wanted something that was going to maybe not resemble the job that we've done previously, but to have the facility and to have the people around and to be able to offer that to the general public as well as sports people and professionals. And it's hard work, but it's in a different way, and certainly have, I guess, a degree of control over it. And very quickly worked out that actually having weekends off is such a brilliant thing. So be able to finish work on a Friday and not have to work till the Mondays, was having done that for 20 odd years. Christmas Day, Boxing Day, holidays. It's been fantastic from that point of view. Hard work, but fantastic from that point of view.
Oh, definitely. And so as you're saying, still go to the club and everything these days as a fan. And what have you made of recent kind of, specifically the injury side of things? Because Reading have had, a really tumultuous time of it in the last couple of seasons, particularly last season with the injuries. Do you kind of sit there and think, oh, maybe they're doing this or that? Because, some of them, it feels like, I think Yaku Mate's was a bit of a freak injury from what I heard with his knee. But then there were lots of players just kind of dropping out of quite consistently.
Yeah, I think it's always difficult to have opinions from outside of it. I know from when you're within the club, it's, the only people who really know what's going on are the people who are sort of directly involved with it. But what I would say is that I think once you have a number of injuries, if you have 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then medical departments, like any other department, can get a little bit overwhelmed by that. And rather than having lots of attention around just 1 or 2 of the injuries that you can really focus on and get back, if you're suddenly faced with 7, 8 or 9 or 10, you have to share your time around for that. And then when, someone who's playing has maybe got a little knock they're trying to carry, they don't quite get the attention just because there isn't the time, to deal with that with a small medical department. So that's why you see these clusters of injuries. And then obviously, at the whole club, everyone wants these players back. They can sometimes get forced back. Then that's when you endanger re-injuring, and it becomes a bit of a sort of a negative cycle. But there's lots of factors to it, Mark, in terms of the players you recruit. When you recruit them, what's their injury history like? What's their age like? What's their sort of, their background like? So, you can, as we talked about earlier, actually sort of predict these things. And if you assemble a squad of players who are slightly older with a slightly injury history, then you add an acute injury at the beginning of that, like you say, Mate at the beginning of that, that's going to be a season out. You can accumulate an injury list quite quickly on that side of it. So I think there are a number of factors. One of the things actually is when I did leave, the thing that we talked about, the injury prevention sort of program that we put in place, was sort of got rid of pretty much straight after. So that was something that we had to spend a lot of time working on to achieve, good buy-in from the players. And that sort of went out the back. So that was a disappointment, that I'd heard that side of it had changed, because I think that, obviously makes a difference. That's certainly my sort of belief on there. But no, it's difficult to make a sort of an opinion from the outside is very difficult, because I think all these things, there's lots of factors sort of involved with that side of it. I think people always look at the medical department, but I know, the medical side there, they've got very good staff involved. And so I think, there's lots of factors, to be had around it.
Yeah, for sure. And last question then, as Gunners fan, what do you make of the team and everything at the moment, the kind of prospects for the club on the pitch moving forward?
I think over the years, it's been a bit of a lean time for the club. There are issues, around the football club there have been over the last sort of best part of a decade, really, in terms of ownership, and the model of the club has changed a lot. The club that I went into in 2007 had an owner, director of football, manager, very streamlined, never spent big transfer deals, but would make the best out of the players that they got, recruited phenomenally well, made the best of those players, sold them at the top of the market, and ran a very good football club from that point of view with a lot of success. And I think you do live and die by your recruitment to a certain extent. And I think that's been, the club has made lots of mistakes from what it looks like from the outside. And I think that's cost them. And I think they seem to have stabilised this year. There's this constant battle against relegation where everyone will say just need to stay up. It leads to a lot of short-term thinking. You saturate your players with loan players, short-term deals, older players, and you lurch from season to season. And at some stage, you need to look at what you've got and get back to a system where you recruit well, you get your academy players coming through, a bit like they've done in the past, and play a certain way, which is progressive. So I think, they seem to have stabilised this year, but I think they've got some, there's still some way to go to get back to close to the club that they were, in the last sort of decade.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fair, and I think it certainly links towards the injury stuff as well when you're signing players like Sam Hutchinson and Scott Dan, who have had big issues recently, and then obviously continue to struggle, don't they? So that's just how it is. But no, honestly, Luke, genuinely really fascinating chat to have you on. So good as well to talk about a lot of memories and to get some insight into things that certainly the fans don't always get the insight on at the time. So no, thank you very much for coming on.
No, my pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Keep up to date with all things Reading FC. Follow the Tilehurst End on Facebook and Twitter.
This podcast is proudly sponsored by ZCZ Films. Remember, if you want to get involved in sponsoring the show, drop us an email to thetilehurstend@gmail.com.